during the Menzies era, and particularly how this scholarship program transformed their lives. So we're very excited to be able to have what is the first output for this research program. Thank you.
How are we going? Yeah, I see. My report's Patnick. Yep. Thanks very much, Zach, for that welcome, and thank you all for coming along today and listening to us. So yes, I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners on the lands on which we meet today. We're presenting a paper, it's a double act, so we're going to have to be disciplined. I'm talking mostly to myself when I say that, about keeping to time. So we're drawing on an oral history project that we've established, funded, as Zach has indicated, by the Robert Menzies Institute, assisted by research assistant Noah Carliff as well. And we've interviewed to date 15 recipients of Commonwealth Scholarships, of some 31 that we have approached. We asked these people about their experiences of coming to university, their living and family circumstances, a whole lot of really impertinent questions. But we placed the Commonwealth Scholarship at the front, and we're really grateful to all of our interviewees who are very generous with their time and very considered in their comments. So our aim was to try and recover the influence of the Commonwealth Scholarship Scheme, which we think has receded into the background of the story of Australian higher education and of Australia more generally. We wanted to conduct an oral history interview as well, because one of the things that really interests me is the student experience. It's something today that's very relevant to universities, but finding that historically is very difficult sometimes. So the Commonwealth, as it was known, was a feature of the period of sustained economic prosperity and full employment, known as the Long Boom. And its function was to meet an acute and long-standing skills shortage in many areas, and Jennifer's just indicated science as one of those, but especially in the professional or managerial level. It became a signature higher education policy over 23 years, in part because Menzies was Prime Minister for so long, but also because his government built upon it and extended it. So our oral histories have revealed the tensions between policy and practice as students navigated a complex bureaucratic system of financial support. A series of individual decisions made to meet diverse circumstances became settled patterns in the expansion of Australian higher education, forged by public subsidy for individual students. So through our talk today, we're going to feature extracts from many of these interviews. But first, a brief overview of the Commonwealth, so we're all across exactly how that works. So it was a scheme established in 1951 and continued until 1973. It continued and built on a World War II Commonwealth financial assistance scheme that had been created during the war to provide support for students in reserved courses. And that had been continued for 5 years after the peace. So the Commonwealth was offered preferentially to all qualifying matriculants on the basis of their results, so it's a merit-based scheme. It covered tuition fees and all other compulsory charges, such as student, union and sports fees, and it also offered a means-tested living allowance at differential rates for scholars who lived away from the family home. So the scholarships could be applied, once you won a scholarship, you could apply that to any university course, unlike the Commonwealth Financial Assistance Scheme during the Second World War, and indeed unlike the Commonwealth Reconstruction Training Scheme, which was a post-war Australian GI Bill, another Commonwealth support for higher education. The Commonwealth Scholarship covered the full duration of a person's degree and had no service prerogative. The scheme was directed at school leavers, So initially those under 20 years, with a small number dedicated for mature-aged applicants over 25. And from 1962, scholarships were also offered to students in the later years of their degrees as proven candidates, if you like. So the scheme was introduced with 3,000 scholarships, and we have a nifty graph there. A number increased, and the first year you see a larger number because it was applied to people who would have been eligible who had already begun their degree in the first year. So it began with 3,000, and then after 1961 especially, it ratcheted up such that by 1973, 13,200 scholarships were awarded. And across this period, the scheme supported between a third and a fifth of all university students. One of the things we're interested in this is that it's a very general scheme, but we think it also diverted students, changed their approach, and that's one of the themes of all of our interviews. So we've guided these into some themes, and the first one is finding pathways. So a living allowance, as I mentioned before, was available, but only at a very low rate, roughly half the basic wage throughout this period, and this reduced sharply when a means test was applied to what was then known as the aggregate family income, including earnings from the students themselves. Managing this was a consideration for all our interviewees, even if for some it was a much smaller issue. For others, it determined how they completed their education, whether they would need to live at home or whether they could go further afield for study. And we've got an extract here from a University of Melbourne Faculty of Law handbook from 1960 showing the kind of individual decision people would need to take and how the means-tested living allowance, which was already, as I say, half the basic wage, reduced further very quickly on just a very moderate income. All the people we interviewed took some form of work while they were studying. Mostly that was vacation work, but others also worked on weekends or at the residential college in which they resided. So we find that students have to find solutions to meet their own circumstances. And this shaped all manner of things. So students had to become strategic in choosing their subjects in the end of their second year, their secondary education. We have an example here of a student, an art student at the University of Tasmania, who it became common to do a second year of matriculation, so a finishing year of high school, partly to do with maturity, but also, as we found, to do with winning the scholarship. So this student stacked all of their better subjects in the first year, hoping to win the scholarship, and then they would go on to do some of the subjects they were weaker in, hoping then to take their scholarship and do a medical degree. Circumstances intervened, as it did with so many others, meaning the student undertook an arts degree. Often students had to manage a combination of arrangements alongside their Commonwealth Scholarship, and because this combination was specific to them, they had to work it out by themselves. And so here's an example of a student attending ANU who's applying for a national undergrad scholarship. The really important thing about this quote, though, is the last line, "I was pursuing this by myself." It's a personal decision. Your own circumstances vary so much that you have to fit within the scheme and the supports that are provided. The requirements of applying for scholarships and applying for various combinations of support also meant that people had to nominate in advance what they planned to do, and students could then find themselves constrained. So we have another student at ANU who undertook a BA because that's what they wrote down on their initial scholarship application. They were trapped in that field, and in fact, this was fine for them. But it shows how the process of having to apply for various forms of support directs you into your degree. This is a very long quote. The scholarship was applied for first degrees only, except that it could be extended into professional postgraduate diplomas, notably something like a Diploma of Education. It also meant that changing degrees could be a fraught process and potentially costly for the individual if it meant a cessation of the Commonwealth. Now, here's an example of a student who became interested in microbiology and decided, well, maybe I could apply to change into medicine. But to do so, they would have to go back a year. I mean, it gets very complex and arcane, you can see. They'd have to go back a year, and in that year, they would lose their scholarship for the year, which was a great risk, and this person weighed the failure rate and the prospects and so forth. And in the end, they decided that they couldn't do it. So we see this generous scheme also really shaping the way people approached their education. And I'll hand over to Gwil to take off the other half of our session.
Thanks very much, James. My notes in the right place. So, as we've alluded to, the oral histories have really recounted how the Commonwealth was the first time that there was a nationwide scheme that provided a pathway through university for students from families with modest means that relied solely on their academic performance. As James has spoken about in the last few minutes, students were often had to be quite strategic, and some of the features of the scheme, which we'll turn to now, both guided their pathways, but when we're starting to think about the legacy of the scheme, we're starting to think about the impact of the scheme, we'll turn now to think about some of the opportunities and obligations that the scheme placed upon students and how it enabled them in many ways. So, it offered more than opportunities for career and employment for many students that came from modest means. It also offered the intangible status signifiers that university provided. And we've put up a quote here from a student, an interviewee, that recounted to us that they had come from a family of modest means. And I think it's the last line that we wanted to really pick up on, which is where they say, I thought, well, why not? Why not me? And that is part of the important contribution that the Commonwealth made, that's what we'll turn to now, is in changing notions of student support, what it would mean, what it could mean, and indeed what came later. And we'll turn to that in a moment. But first, the Commonwealth was both open to men and women without consideration. And this was significant, as such an approach to gender equality was not provided in many other areas. We've talked about this earlier today. So, for example, in the Australian public service, women were routinely let go after marriage. And we've just put up a quote here that we thought really encapsulated this. It was something that was picked up by a number of our interviewees that this was not something that the restrictions they did not feel at university, and was certainly a benefit of the Commonwealth. The Commonwealth also gave students space and confidence to focus on their study. So, for example, we show here the case of a student who attained a Commonwealth only after their third year, having taken a loan for their first 2 years. And this is really critical because, as this quote says, and it's there in the last line, they wouldn't have done a PhD and got into a research career if they hadn't got the Commonwealth Scholarship. It really was one of the first schemes that enabled people, because of the fact that it didn't have the reserved courses, the CFAS previous scheme, and it allowed people to follow their interests in a way that other schemes had not. For some, the funds that the scholarship provided were just spending money. For others, they were much more significant and created opportunities that were not there. And we have this wonderful quote from one of our interviewees about a multicoloured pair of beachcomber shoes and that they were repaired by a friend of theirs, you'll see up there, and that people made do. But really critical, so we've talked a bit about opportunities and obligations, really critical for us to consider when assessing and thinking about the Commonwealth is the questions of prestige and privilege that it brought. The Commonwealth had a definite prestige associated with the award that many interviewees identified as something they were conscious of both during their studies and subsequently. It marked out recipients as students who were most able to benefit from university. And I think it's really critical. Most able to benefit. Clearly, recipients' prospects were not determined exclusively by the scholarship, rather it gave them scope to succeed. And we have a wonderful quote here that encapsulates that and says, in my first year, there's a status hierarchy where the Commonwealth Scholarship was on top. Many other support schemes, such as the studentships, teachers' studentships and industry cadetships, included an employment bond, but also had effectively a higher amount provided for living allowance than the Commonwealth did. Now, avoiding the bond was a marker of prestige, but this came at a cost. Now, some families made sacrifices to make up the difference, as we can see here in a quote from one interviewee who said their parents, said they were definitely not going to give them a bond, and so ensured that they were able to have a living allowance. But others tried to make ends meet. Tried to make up for this through paid employment, especially during the long vacations. And we've got a quote there of one of our interviewees who essentially followed the experience of their sibling to do vacation work. So we've just talked about some of the different features of the Commonwealth and some of the experiences of those that we interviewed through the oral histories. So what might we make of the Commonwealth? Well, we've put up here a quote from Australian economic historian Brian Fitzpatrick in an address to students at the University of Melbourne in 1961. And I might just read it out because I'm conscious people might not be able to see it in the back of the room. Several thousand of you all have fees and some living expenses paid by the Commonwealth Scholarships branch. That in itself involves a vast change in community elite, in its composition and social obligation. But further, I don't know whether you have considered the relative independence it confers on the beneficiaries. Independence of family, of mum and dad, and of rich uncle or cousin. This is perhaps the most significant social aspect of the change. Now, we argue through our study that our study really helps explain what this relative independence was. Our study has shown that for students, the relative independence was that where they were participants in a conversation taking place in homes across the country at the time. With these scholarships, they gained a role in making plans. While they were still constrained, they were often much less so than in earlier schemes and in some ways subsequently. Indeed, our study has shown the extent to which students had to weigh up so many different questions, but in this they had agency in seeking answers. The Commonwealth provided a scaffold that students could climb, but the ascent was different depending on a range of considerations, some of which we've discussed. One thing we might reflect on at this distance is that the full influence of the Commonwealth has been perhaps obscured in part because of the variation in the experience of different students. Nevertheless, it was influential on the outlook of generations of students. So what might we make of the Commonwealth? As one interviewee related to us, and we've put the quote up here, what did the Commonwealth give them? Choice, flexibility, and dignity. Now, just as a final word, we might say that despite the different objectives of those student support policies that have followed the Commonwealth, what we might conclude is that these ideals have been preserved and they really are the enduring legacy of the Commonwealth Scholarship. Thank you.
Did anything really surprise you, something that you weren't expecting when you actually started collecting these oral histories?
Did anything surprise? I would say that we sort of anticipated that there would be a variation in experience. I would say I was personally, well, delighted by the range of responses that we had and how generous people with their time, as I mentioned. But and the range of different experiences of students within this scheme, I think that was the thing that most surprised me, actually. That individual students found all manner of accommodations and ways to get through university. When I think about university policy and the nostalgia that infects it for this period in particular, there's a sense that, oh, this scheme existed, or that, you know, there's a period of fees, and then there's a period of various scholarships and studentships, and then there's a fee abolition and so forth. Within those broad eras, if you like, there is enormous diversity, and this one in particular I think is really fascinating. And I've been enriched listening to the other speakers today about this period, because you can see how you have these policies, but people are finding their own way within them. And you can almost get at, I mean, we've done very few interviews really to get a whole, you know, understanding, but we get some picture of how the general objectives of people shift and how they change, and how interested people are in attending higher education. What about you, Gwil?
One thing I might add is I was quite surprised just how important the Commonwealth was for a number of rural students, a number of interviewees, and it really did enable them to attend university, and I think it opened up possibilities, at least for our interviewees, that they hadn't considered. Judy?
Thanks. I'm obviously the generation that got a Commonwealth Scholarship, but I didn't get a living allowance. And you referred a few times to people of modest means. In my experience with the cohort that I would have gone through with in the 60s, most people of modest means took studentships. That gave them a lot more money. It constrained their subject choices, made it difficult to do honours. But I just wondered if, you know, you were able to have done any comparisons of the sort of socio-economic status of the people on the Commonwealth Scholarships and the people who took studentships.
No, thanks. And you've identified the next phase of part of this project, which is to look more extensively at studentships. I think one of the things that really interested both of us, if I could speak for both of us, was that for those students where they felt that they needed a studentship because of the additional financial resources, but balance that off against doing something that the studentship wouldn't support, or they couldn't find the right cadetship, they had to act quite strategically, right? So I think it will be interesting to see, you know, whether it was enabling a number of students from modest means, or really whether we've just happened to have some of those that we've interviewed. I mean, we interviewed one person that went to ANU, then they had to effectively go and beg, argue their case, I suppose is a better way to put it, with the Commonwealth Scholarships Office to get an out-of-home allowance, you know, because of the particular rules during that year. So yes, it's certainly the next thing we'll look at.
Thank you, that was fascinating. There were three arguments that were advanced for the introduction of HECS. Two were explicit, one was implicit. The first was a sociological observation that free access to education had really done very little for broadening demographic participation in higher education. The second was to fund a massive expansion of an amalgamated higher education system. And the third implicit one was that a lot of people who drove those reforms didn't believe that the free education system at the university level was delivering a quality education. If I work back through those, or at least an education that was responding in the ways that they felt it should do to economic change, if we work back through those, do you feel that the scheme you're looking at was enabling a broader demographic participation in higher education? was the more limited university system it was serving at that time, with that division between the technical colleges was that a kind of a good thing in a way for its time? And thirdly, was there a sense in which this scheme, rewarding talented kids, actually giving a kind of a sense of mission to those who were teaching in universities that actually was valuable for them as well?
Yeah,
I'll say something as well.
Yeah, I mean, yes, I can hear in your question the criticisms of people like Don Anderson, who conducted these amazing surveys that showed that this did not a job to change. It wasn't an equity policy. However, if you look further in particular that Brian Fitzpatrick quote that we had, Brian Fitzpatrick is a scholarship boy who came to university, who spent his university career hunting. He called it pot hunting, trying to find bits of money, trying to cajole a church to give him some money, try to sort of ingratiate himself with the donors of money and get through university. And he would say, "Oh, you've got it so easy. You've got this general scheme that you win because of you're in the top fifth of students or something, or the top third of students. So this provides you a way, and I couldn't dream of this amazing opportunity." So the Commonwealth Scholarship Scheme was absolutely not, an equity policy in those terms. It wasn't directed along those lines. It was a merit-based scholarship. However, enterprising individuals could get through, but as subsequent governments came in with different priorities and different objectives, so they devised different schemes to try and meet those different objectives. Yeah.
I only got time for one more.
You can get this one. Sorry, I totally took that.
Hi. My brother was a recipient of one of those Commonwealth Scholarship things, right? And he did move out of home to get the living away from allowance. And it was based on the income, because he was the eldest of 12 children. My recollection is, though, he had to do exams, and it wasn't really sort of just an open... You had to actually qualify. You had to apply for it, and you had to qualify for it, and you had to do well in the exams to actually get it. That's my recollection. I'm just wondering whether I've dreamed it.
No, and that does lead on from the previous question. I mean, I don't, maybe we didn't emphasise it enough, but I think one of the distinguishing features about the Commonwealth from other schemes is that it really wanted to provide for students that were probably most able to benefit from university. Why is the most able important? Because what we've seen since, including really with some of the logic behind HECS, is that it's for those that are able to benefit, okay? It's got a very different baseline. It is really trying to provide an equality of opportunity for those that are high achievers, as opposed to it's not an equity policy in that regard. And we might reflect on what we've lost where we don't have that kind of support for students, I think. We've got it in other ways, but as we've said, this was a nationwide scheme, right? It was regularised. So that question of equality of opportunity, I think, is really important in understanding the Commonwealth. But obviously, constrained. Yeah. Maybe it's overreach.
Thank you.